28th March 2017. Before sunrise in Lithuania, armed officers surrounded a house where a man had been hiding for a decade. Years later in the UK, detectives were piecing together another operation, one involving hidden weapons, encrypted phones, and drugs worth millions. Two very different cases. One common thread, men who thought they could never be touched. Until a single detail, small and almost invisible, began the chain of events that brought both of them to justice. This is the story of James Mulvey and of Najib Salim and Nahidul Monaf, and how their empires finally came crashing down. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Before we get to how this empire was finally taken apart, we need to go back to where it all began. The story begins in the Worcestershire countryside. Inkbarrow is the sort of place most would pass through without a second thought. In 2007, it became the unlikeliest staging post for a smuggling route worth tens of millions. The method was both simple and ingenious. Hollow industrial rollers, each weighing hundreds of kilos, moved between warehouses in Holland, Belgium, and the UK. To anyone on the outside, they were ordinary freight, part of the routine flow of haulage across Europe. Inside were tightly packed consignments of cocaine, cannabis, and phenacetin, a cutting agent used to stretch the Class A supply. The rollers would pass through the West Midlands, stop at a yard in Inkbarrow, and continue on to Ireland, where the loads were broken down and distributed. For a time, it worked flawlessly. At least 14 trips were believed to have gone through without interference. But then, in a warehouse outside Antwerp, one worker noticed something odd. The same rollers were moving in and out of the depot too often to be coincidence. Suspicion turned into action as Belgian authorities took one apart. What they found inside confirms the suspicion. We will talk about this in a few minutes. Rather than seize the cargo outright, investigators set a trap. They allowed a controlled delivery to continue, tracking the roller as it passed through Worcestershire on its way to North Dublin. Each movement was watched, each transfer logged. When officers finally moved in, the evidence was undeniable. An international pipeline of drugs disguised as freight are running between continental Europe and Britain. The bust in February 2007 didn't just reveal a single shipment. It exposed the framework of an operation that had been running for months, perhaps years. And what investigators uncovered next showed the true scale of what they were dealing with. The February 2007 seizure in Belgium was treated as more than just a lucky interception. In court, the judge made it clear. This was a representative load, evidence that spoke for a much larger conspiracy. The numbers were staggering: 20 kilos of high-purity cocaine, 364 kilos of cannabis, and 10 kilos of phenacetin. As we discussed earlier, 14 previous trips were identified as having likely gone through undetected, each one packed in the same style and almost the same weight. If the estimates were correct, it meant that more than 5,400 kilos of cannabis and 300 kilos of cocaine had already been shipped through the same route. The value placed on those consignments was equally jaw-dropping. The cocaine alone was worth at least £17 million, with a street value that could rise to £42 million. The cannabis, what reports suggests at retail level, was put at around £60 million. Added together, the conspiracy was moving between £68 million and £100 million in drugs. For a smuggling operation based around haulage yards and transport companies, the profits were enormous. Behind the logistics sat a network of bogus firms, shell operations designed to look legitimate. On paper, JBS Transport, Mulvey's Birmingham haulage business, appeared to be just another subcontractor, even receiving millions in payments from TNT, one of the UK's largest delivery companies. But in reality, those same vehicles were the backbone of an industrial-scale trafficking enterprise. What made the scheme harder to detect was its normality. Lorries passed through familiar checkpoints, drivers filed standard paperwork, and freight yards like Inkbarrow seemed routine and unremarkable. For the first time, investigators could see the size of the network in front of them. But unpicking who was behind it and how many hands were involved would take years. And while some of those hands were quickly caught, one figure had already slipped out of reach. And that is what we are covering next. By 2009, the case was heard at Birmingham Crown Court. Prosecutors laid out all the undeniable evidence. Two key figures took center stage at that trial. Barry Phipps, the transport manager, was described as the man who kept the wheels running. He organized the journeys, ensured the consignments kept moving, and made sure the shipments appeared routine. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Alongside him was Jeffrey Edwards, the lorry driver trusted to move the drugs across borders. His role in carrying the loads earned him 20 years behind bars. In total, 5 men were convicted that year, receiving combined sentences of more than 86 years. I researched deeply to find the details of the other 3 men, but I could not find any reliable sources that named them or showed their images. For law enforcement, it was a decisive blow, but one man was missing. James Mulvey, the haulage boss described by investigators as the ghost, had vanished. Just days before the arrests, he had left the country. It wasn't an impulsive move, it was a calculated disappearance. Mulvey understood that the noose was tightening and slipped through it before the first knock came at the door. His absence cast a shadow over the convictions. The drivers and managers were in prison, but the man at the center had slipped away. From that point on, Mulvey was spoken of as one of the untouchables, and the hunt for him was only just beginning. His methods were meticulous. Used disposable phones. Hotel stays were paid in cash, and for financial movements, he relied on layers of trusts, advisors, and offshore accounts, laundering millions while keeping his own name out of the paperwork. The system wasn't perfect, but it was enough to frustrate investigators for years. By the time authorities tried to trace him, Mulvey was always a step ahead. Yet while he left almost no paper trail, he made no attempt to hide his wealth. In southern Spain, he built a £1.5 million villa near Marbella, complete with indoor and outdoor pools, a cinema room, and a private lift between floors. He was seen wearing Rolex watches, driving top-end cars including Range Rovers and Mercedes, and fueling what prosecutors later described as a £1,000 a week cocaine habit. Estimates suggested he was spending as much as £75,000 in cash every week, funding holidays, hotels, and luxury goods. He traveled extensively, using bespoke holiday companies to arrange 22 overseas trips while keeping ties to the UK. His children, though he lived abroad, were enrolled in private schools in Worcestershire and Somerset, a visible reminder of the wealth the smuggling operation had generated. To those around him, Mulvey appeared as a successful businessman, but behind the facade, he was keeping his head just low enough to avoid direct attention. Always shifting, always careful, his lifestyle had the hallmarks of someone who believed he had slipped beyond the reach of the law. For years it seemed to work. He invested in nightclubs and bars, mixed in the expatriate scene, and built a reputation as a man impossible to pin down. But luxury and secrecy could only go so far. The longer Mulvey stayed free, the more determined investigators became to break through the smoke he created. And when violence began to spill into his circle, his ghost-like existence was pulled back into focus. And that is what we will discuss next. Investigators traced Mulvey's movements abroad and found he wasn't acting alone. Evidence later presented in court revealed that he was part of a tight circle of 4 men who ran the smuggling pipeline. Mulvey was the logistics brain, the one who controlled the lorries and the freight firms. Alongside him was Gerard Hatchett Kavanagh, an Irish enforcer with a reputation for violence. 2 others completed the group, one known only as Glasses, and another associate whose name was never publicly confirmed. Together, the 4 formed a crew that connected the Midland supply chain with powerful Irish crime families. These included the Kinahan cartel and the extended Kavanagh network, both of which dominated drug trafficking routes between continental Europe and Ireland. Mulvey's role gave him direct access to the cross-border supply lines, moving drugs from Holland and Belgium through the UK before their final delivery in Dublin. The alliances carried with them the same risks as the rewards. By 2014, that danger became clear. Gerard Kavanagh was gunned down in a bar in Marbella, a public execution in broad daylight. His death sent shockwaves through the Irish underworld, signaling open conflict among rival factions. For Mulvey, it was also a reminder that the life he was living was balanced on a knife edge. Covert recordings obtained by the National Crime Agency gave a glimpse into just how aware he was of the threat. In one conversation, captured on tape, he was heard explaining to a woman that in his world, retribution wasn't aimed directly at you. It was aimed at those closest to you. As he put it, they kill the people you love. The recordings became a rare window into the mindset of a man who projected untouchability, but privately admitted that the danger was constant. Mulvey's international ties gave him influence, wealth, and protection, but they also kept him locked in a violent circle. And as the NCA continued to track him, the same connections that once made him powerful were now making him vulnerable. When the roller shipments were exposed in 2007, for most traffickers, the loss of such a carefully constructed route would have been crippling. But for James Mulvey, it became the trigger for adaptation. According to investigators, Mulvey and his associates began experimenting with new ways to disguise their consignments. Drugs were packed into the shells of inflatable sea scooters, watercraft that looked like leisure equipment, harmless and easy to ship. Other loads were hidden inside replica motorbikes, including Harley Davidsons, their hollow frames concealing tightly wrapped cocaine and cannabis. The shipments followed a familiar path. They were smuggled into the UK, routed through King's Heath in Birmingham, and from there pushed onwards into Ireland. For Mulvey, it was a continuation of the same trade, only under different packaging. Each disguise gave the appearance of legitimate goods, the kind of cargo unlikely to raise suspicion during transport. This shift in methods showed both Mulvey's ingenuity and his determination. Even as his former associates served decades in prison, he pressed ahead with new consignments. But every adjustment left traces, and what Mulvey didn't know was that, while he refined his methods, investigators were quietly building something far more dangerous. A surveillance net that would follow him across countries, across years, and right into his most private moments. The National Crime Agency took the files from West Midlands Police and launched a new, expansive investigation. This time, it wouldn't be limited to haulage yards and customs seizures. Mulvey had been free for years, moving across Europe and beyond, and to catch him, the NCA needed to reach far beyond the Midlands. The scale of the operation was extraordinary. It stretched across 9 countries, combining surveillance units, financial analysts, and liaison officers in Europe and further afield. Teams worked through more than 20 million documents, dissecting trusts, offshore accounts, and complex money movements designed to disguise profits. At the same time, covert units placed Mulvey under close watch, recording his conversations and movements whenever possible. What they captured was telling. In one recording, Mulvey could be heard boasting to a woman, "No one can control me. I'm fucking nuts." The bravado matched the reputation he had built for himself, but in another moment, the mask slipped. He admitted openly that he feared assassination, what we have covered in the previous part of the video. For investigators, it was evidence of a man both arrogant and deeply aware of the risks surrounding him. The surveillance didn't just focus on Mulvey himself. After his arrest in Lithuania, investigators kept watching his circle. In April 2017, undercover officers secretly filmed a meeting involving his father, James Mulvey Sr., at Sutton Coldfield Crematorium. Sitting on a bench with him was a figure investigators could not identify at first. But when the footage was reviewed, the man was confirmed as Thomas Kavanagh, a powerful figure in the Kinahan cartel and Mulvey's own cousin. Only a week later, Mulvey Sr. was seen again, this time at Kingsbury Leisure Centre outside Birmingham. On that occasion, Kavanagh was joined by Sean McGovern, another senior Kinahan associate who would later flee to Dubai. The meetings, both discreet and away from public attention, showed that even while Mulvey was locked in a Lithuanian cell, the networks around him were still active and still tied to the most dangerous players in the Irish underworld. For years, he had been the ghost no one could pin down. By 2017, the NCA were finally in position to strike. Mulvey had finally been tracked to Kaunas, Lithuania, and on the morning of the 28th of March 2017, before sunrise, Lithuanian special forces surrounded the property. They moved in with weapons drawn, storming the house in a rapid assault. Inside, James Mulvey was caught completely off guard. Half-dressed, he was forced to the ground at gunpoint. The images, later released by authorities, showed a man who for years had styled himself as untouchable, now pinned on the floor barefoot with rifles trained on him. Reports from the raid stated that a firearm, 100 rounds of ammunition, and ballistic vests were also seized at the property. Cash and other items were recovered in connected searches. Whether or not Mulvey ever planned to use the weapons remains unclear, but the discovery underscored the high-risk world he had been living in. For law enforcement, the arrest was a landmark. Now, under a European arrest warrant, he was swiftly extradited back to the UK. From Kaunas to Crown Court, the ghost who had evaded capture for so long was finally within reach of British justice. The arrest marked the end of his life as a fugitive and the beginning of the trial that would determine just how long he would spend behind bars. In the spring of 2018, James Mulvey finally stood trial at Birmingham Crown Court, where for 10 weeks the jury heard the full scale of the conspiracy. The charges set before them were fourfold: 2 counts of conspiring to import cocaine and 2 counts of conspiring to smuggle cannabis, stretching across 2006 and 2007. Prosecutors described both smuggling strategies along with all the surveillance methods they gathered in a long time frame that we have already covered in detail. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict came back guilty. Mulvey was convicted on all 4 conspiracy charges. In June 2018, Judge Mark Wall QC delivered the sentence. He described Mulvey's actions as large-scale industrial smuggling, a conspiracy that had brought tons of drugs into the UK and Ireland. He told the court there was no sign of remorse, no acknowledgement of the damage the trade had caused to communities. For Mulvey, the profit had always been the priority. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison. It was one of the longest terms handed down for a trafficking conspiracy of its kind in the UK at the time. While James Mulvey's downfall played out in court, another investigation was quietly building hundreds of miles away. By the time police began closing in, 2 names stood at the center of the operation: Najib Salim and Nahidul Munaf. Salim, then in his mid-40s, lived in Lee. He was the senior figure and the organizer. Investigators described him as the one who controlled the supply lines, moving cocaine and cannabis through established contacts while also reaching into the firearms trade. His reach stretched across Greater Manchester and beyond, and he dealt in commodities that brought both profit and power. Monaf, 10 years younger, came from Moss Side. He was close to Salim, but his role was different. He was the man tied to cultivation, responsible for cannabis production, and directly connected to the firearms that police would later uncover. Together they formed a partnership where drugs and guns moved side by side. It wasn't just about narcotics. The firearms were treated as part of the same trade, bought, stored, and moved through the same criminal contacts. Messages later recovered from encrypted devices showed a different picture. We will talk about it in a few minutes. Like many organized crime figures of their generation, they relied heavily on technology to protect themselves. Salim, in particular, turned to EncroChat. He operated under the alias Rafael Caro Quintero, named after a Mexican cartel boss, a choice that gave investigators a clear indication of how he saw himself. At the same time, anti-surveillance devices were found in his possession, including a radio frequency detector designed to pick up tracking signals on vehicles or phones. For both men, the investment was heavy. They poured money into cannabis farms, ammunition stockpiles, encrypted phones, and equipment to keep their operation hidden. And for a time, it worked. But in 2019, a raid on a quiet suburban street in Cheadle would expose the first cracks. The operation against Najib Salim and Nahidul Monaf began not with a major seizure of drugs, but with a discovery in a suburban back garden. In October 2019, police raided a house on Kingsway in Cheadle. It was an unremarkable property, the kind that drew no attention from neighbours. But in a shed at the bottom of the garden, officers uncovered something entirely out of place: 2 self-loading pistols and a quantity of ammunition. At first, the find seemed almost detached from the house itself. The occupants were quickly ruled out as suspects. They had no involvement, no ties to firearms, and no explanation for why the shed had been used as an armory. But detectives soon learned that the shed had been accessed by outsiders, men carrying out building work at the address. CCTV footage gave the first real break. The images showed Nahidul Monaf visiting the shed repeatedly in the days before the raid. His presence, along with his connection to Najib Salim, shifted the focus of the investigation. Forensic analysis of the weapons and the shed itself reinforced the suspicion, tying Monaf directly to the hidden guns. From that point on, the firearms conspiracy had 2 names attached to it, but the case didn't end with that single raid. Detectives knew they had only scratched the surface. The presence of pistols in a garden shed suggested there could be more weapons hidden elsewhere. So in January 2020, just 3 months later, police returned to the same Kingsway address for a second, more exhaustive search. This time, they looked higher. In the loft space, accessible only by a hatch, officers made another discovery. A 3rd gun was recovered, along with further ammunition and a silencer. The find was as significant as it was alarming. It suggested the pistols weren't isolated. They were part of a wider arsenal, stored in places where Monaf had access under the cover of legitimate work. The pattern was becoming clear. Each return to the property revealed more evidence, and each find pulled Monaf and Salim deeper into the investigation. What had started with a single shed had now escalated into the recovery of multiple firearms, ammunition, and equipment designed to make them deadlier. For detectives, the raids confirmed 2 things. The weapons belonged to men already under surveillance, and those men were part of a broader criminal conspiracy. Salim and Monaf were no longer just names in intelligence reports. They were active players in an operation that blended drug trafficking with the storage and movement of firearms. By early 2020, the arsenal was exposed, but investigators still didn't know the full scale of what they were dealing with. The answer would come from a very different source that we will discuss now. In mid-2020, under Operation Venetic, the National Crime Agency and European partners infiltrated EncroChat, capturing thousands of conversations in real time. The messages attached to Najib Salim's profile revealed a man deeply entrenched in the highest risk end of the trade. Thousands of exchanges painted a detailed picture. Salim wasn't just buying and selling cannabis. He was brokering bulk cocaine deals, moving large consignments with regularity, while also maintaining his foothold in the firearms market. The scale of the conversations left little doubt. This was a man treating guns and drugs as parallel commodities. Some messages were especially chilling. In one, he pressed a contact to source ammunition in bulk: 250, 300, 500, as many as you can get. In another, he boasted about acquiring grenades and described a 6-sprayer gun, a weapon designed for maximum damage. One thread detailed how 2 bullets would be enough to do the job, as long as they didn't miss. For police, it was unfiltered evidence of intent. Now, with this evidence, the next step would take them back onto the streets, to Lee, Moss Side, and the cannabis farms of Cheetham Hill. On 8th July 2020, the operation moved into its decisive phase. In Lee, officers closed in on Salim's home on Smallbrook Lane. Inside, they found exactly what they expected: £30,000 in cash, bundles of paperwork tied to the operation, and multiple mobile phones. Among the seizures was a radio frequency detector, which we have already covered. At the same time, another team moved on Nahidul Monaf in Moss Side. His arrest came with another discovery. Cannabis plants were found growing at his address, tying him directly to the cultivation side of the network. What had first appeared as a supporting role now looked more significant, but the real scale of their investment was uncovered further north. Cheetham Hill, an industrial hub in Manchester, housed two separate units used by the pair. When officers forced entry, they found large cannabis farms, fitted with an infrastructure that spoke of serious money and planning. For Greater Manchester Police, the July raids were decisive. They didn't just seize cash, plants and equipment. They pulled apart the structure Salim and Monaf had built. But the story didn't end with the arrests. What followed was a courtroom reckoning. By the time the case reached Manchester Crown Court in May 2024, the evidence against both men was overwhelming. The prosecution laid out the scale of their operation in detail. When it came to sentencing, the distinction in roles was reflected in the terms handed down. Salim, then 45 years old, was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Monaf, 36, received 10 years in prison after pleading guilty. In total, the pair faced 32 years behind bars. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.